It's Tuesday, July 12th, and we are in Williamsburg, Virginia, in our hotel.
We're just checking out, but before that, always a free breakfast. Get these guys loaded on eggs and bacon, and just a quick pose to their introduction.
Making you happy makes us happy.
That's nice. So we are on our way to Mount Vernon, just about 2 hours away in Arlington.
So this is it. We're looking for parking now.
Yep. And we had to pre-buy our tickets way ahead of time to make sure that we have a slot in for this day at this time. We got the grounds and the mansion tour pass, so it will allow us to go inside the house to take a look.
But unfortunately, there was no videotaping inside the house,
so we won't get to see that.
But we got a lot of footage outside the house.
Yeah. So it's also a very big estate. George Washington, who was the first president, lived in this house all his life. He actually inherited it from a brother, the firstborn son of his father. He was the firstborn of a second marriage, so he wasn't supposed to inherit this house. But after his brother died, he did so. And then he extended it and expanded this house once he became the president, from a 4-bedroom house to a 21-bedroom mansion.
Yeah, big.
Complete also with other outhouses.
This is George Washington with Martha and the grandkids. So this says George at 53, and then Martha at 54.
Okay.
And then the granddaughter, and I think that's another.
So he
grandson.
married Martha Custis, and she already had a previous marriage with children, and so he actually never had children of his own. But this is a model replica dollhouse of Mount Vernon mansion itself. And he was not educated much. He actually had to finish school by the age of 14, but he was very widely read.
Yeah.
So
he had a big library.
Made sure that he was up to times with the information that he had, and he was a very prolific letter writer. There's actually about 20,000 letters that we actually have right now in publication. That was by George Washington.
So these are the rooms that we actually saw, and the colors of the wallpaper were
very vibrant.
Were exactly the same as this model.
Exactly. So
after looking at this the second time right now, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that room, and I remember that room.
So this house was first built in the 1600s by his great grandfather, and ultimately it fell to him in the 1740s. He passed away in 1799. But from when he first moved in, he added one addition, and then by the time he became the U.S. president, he added additional wings to this house.
Yes.
And so this is a nice replica of the layout of the house. The house grounds also have other outhouses that we'll see later, including a smokehouse, a salt house, and also areas for where their slaves lived.
We didn't get to see the top.
No, it was closed.
I think it was under renovation, they were saying. So this is a timeline of George Washington through the years, different milestones in his life.
Rise to fame as a general in the Revolutionary War against the British, and ultimately him being Commander-in-Chief and the President of the United States of America.
And then he passed away due to throat
infection.
And
it was quite abrupt that it's to this day people are wondering what else could have gone wrong. So that was a bit of an intriguing information that we learned.
These are nice, what are they called? Stained glass windows?
Stained glass windows, correct.
There's Alexander Hamilton.
And then the whole scene of the Fathers of the Revolution. And then another 2 flanking over at the end. But this was just the information center. When you first come into Mount Vernon, you can buy tickets here, and they give you information as well as to how to go around the grounds. These are the famous quotes of him.
So now we're walking towards the mansion.
Yep.
We're outside.
This is just like a garden area.
There you can see the mansion. That way there's also Washington's tomb.
Yep.
There is the mansion, and you can see they're renovating the top
and restoring.
floor.
So the restoration actually happened 100 years after he died, because it was going into disrepair. But there was the Daughters of the Revolution, a group of women association, who put it upon themselves to raise funds and said, we have to make sure that the house of the first president is beautiful so that others will always be able to visit it in the future.
Those are our tickets. 11:50 a.m. is our tour. And we also got these what
audio aids.
Yeah, audio aids.
And you point them at different tiles that will then have the synchronized audio hearing information for you.
The Biltmore estate had the same thing.
So this is cool. This is called rustification, and how they made the wood look like stone. They put paint on the wood first, and then they throw a handful of clay and stone onto it, and then let it dry. So it actually made it more sturdy.
They also chiseled the wood to make it look
like stone.
Shape of a stone.
So it, again, for colonial times, then this looks like a very grand house, and trying to.
This is me peeking through the window, so you can actually see the first room.
So it's a very, again, vibrant blue-green shade on the wall.
And this is the stone that we're talking about.
But it's actually wood.
Yeah.
That they're able to create this look. And so all this are pretty original pieces, original parts, or if not original, sometime to the same time frame. And over there in the back is the Potomac River, and George Washington would use it to sail towards Washington, D.C., and there's actually a wharf at the back of this house, which is actually maybe the front from the river, that had these impressive columns, which we didn't see because they were under reconstruction.
So this is just a storage room?
Yeah, where they would have their foods.
Clerk's quarters.
So each had a detailed account of what goes into here, the description.
Paint cellar.
So anytime they would have to maintain their furniture, it would go here.
And these are just close to the house, close to the mansion.
Just
smokehouse.
So in terms of like their kitchen, they actually would cook outside, and then they would bring it inside to the dining room, but they wouldn't cook inside the main house. Again, there was no refrigerators then, so the foods didn't last for more than a day.
This is laundry, the wash house.
So again, it's almost like with a big estate like this, it's a full day work for their slaves.
This is like their garage, the riding chair.
This is called the riding. It's a chair literally just on
for the horse
wheels. Yeah. So this was just an area where some of their house slaves lived.
Dung repository.
Oh.
So to use it as fertilizer.
Oh.
And so now we're looking. Oh, we saw some sheep.
Yep, they still had sheep. So in its heyday, it's a very big farm area as well. And that's how people live. You had to grow your fruits, your vegetables, your crops, and also, of course, your livestock.
We're like, is this an original bench?
But they just sat on it, and it, seems sturdy enough.
Okay, so we're approaching Washington's tomb now.
So he was buried here also on the grounds of Mount Vernon, alongside with two others, I think a granddaughter.
And so George Washington, Martha Washington are inside the red
main tomb.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the towers.
And when he passed away, before he passed away, he always noted that he did not want any huge funerary to go for his death. He wanted a very quiet, funeral procession. But of course, being the first president of the United States of America, a lot of American citizens, I think, also threw him a pretty large-ish funeral state.
Yeah. So the tour guide said that George was on the right and Martha was on the left. So this is the slave cemetery.
Burial grounds, yes. And so again, they made a memorial here as well to honor those who served the plantation and made their lives what it was, and again, to commemorate all their efforts during those times. So of course there aren't any tombstones here, but on the ground you can actually see, as we will,
like an outline
with just some string where some of these slaves were interred in the ground. So there's just a commemoration.
The whole area
there, yep, that this entire space.
This was a nice spot as well. People putting
some tokens.
Yeah. And this is the outline.
Yeah. So and then they have one stone there, for example. And again, the grounds here were pretty extensive. At one point, I think even if there's just only 5 family members of the George Washington household, they would have up to 400 slaves working for them. Some of them are house slaves, so like their butler, their housekeeper, their cook, but many others are of course on the fields tending to the farm, tending to the daily routine of repair and maintaining
That was the
the
dock.
wharf. Yeah,
the
the
wharf.
dock. And so this is a bit down towards the water, and it's also where they have a 16-sided barn. But this is quite how large the fields were, the acreage of this estate was. And a long time ago, like, you inherit your slaves. So when George married Martha, she inherited the slaves that her husband owned. And as a woman, you have to have a husband then.
I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that is either. But of course, George Washington himself had inherited slaves from his father and his father's father.
Yeah.
But before the black slaves, there were actually a lot of indentured Caucasian slaves, or those serving time, that they also had from Ireland. However, towards George's lifetime, it reverted more towards the black slavery. And at his death, he actually freed the slaves he inherited, because that's one thing that he really had wanted to do, but no other president following him did so, even if that was part of his desire as a father of the revolution. I believe Hamilton also wanted to free slaves.
So here's a slave cabin, an example of one.
And they're very small quarters, and this is close to the barn, right? There were more above, closer to the house, because of course those slaves needed to tend to the needs of the family while they were in their house during their day-to-day living, like serving them for the dining.
And so you'll see later on, there's different slaves' quarters where they have multiple beds. This seems like it's a single cabin.
And so there's all these cool trails made path over around his forested area, and some are really steep. Some of those steps are really steep, but we are going up Mount Vernon.
Domestic animals.
So he had a lot of pets. He was gifted a lot of pets. Their house too was always full of visitors and other guests. At one point in a year, their guest book indicated that they had up to 600 guests for that year. So people just pop by and they kind of stay for a few days. So it was always a very bustly sort of household.
Yeah.
And at one point, George had written in one of his journals that him and Martha never had a quiet dinner together, just as a couple, for over 20 years.
This is the lower garden where they have all the produce. So they don't need to go to the grocery.
Because there were no groceries, you had to be your own grocery. But again, this speaks to the extent of his wealth, the volume of the produce that he can provide.
And this is where the sick bay is.
The infirmary.
But they call it the gardener's house.
And
the salt house?
Yep, salt house, where they preserve a lot
There's
of their
no
foods.
refrigeration back then.
So their meats, their fish had to be cooked and cured or salted. And also, I was reading, also grains were salted to avoid it from spoiling.
Okay.
I guess, again, salt is a dehydrant, right?
And this is the spinning house where they can...
You have the looms and the spindles and
Yeah.
the weaving machines to create their fabrics and their cloths.
Yes.
So not only was the household provided for, but also each slave was given a specific uniform.
Overseer's quarters. Not sure what overseer.
They're the ones who keep the slaves in line.
I
So
see,
they're
I
the
see.
ones who manage the slaves. And I mean, in some other states, southern
Blacksmith
states.
shop.
Yep.
You had a nice conversation with this guy.
Yep, he's actually a blacksmith there, and he is trying to show how tools were created way back when. Their nails, their hammers, plies, and how they put things together. But he was saying that blacksmiths were actually taken from African countries then.
Who were
because
skilled.
They were already skilled. So that's why they were stolen or kidnapped.
So this is the male's quarters I was talking about. Multiple bunk
Bunks,
beds.
and sometimes two to a bunk.
Oh.
And the darker bricks were the more original parts of this house. So of course, when some slaves will try to run away, but because of their dark skin, they were pretty obvious that they were slaves compared to the indentured European or Caucasian slaves or men
Who can blend in.
who can blend in.
And these are just broken artifacts.
Found around the estate area, and what people were using in terms of china. And so this is the house farm slaves versus the river farm slaves. So
And who belonged to George, who belonged to Martha.
Yep. So they have several farms that they owned altogether, and that made up for the entirety of the estate.
Stove room.
What was the stove room? Where they cooked, I guess?
I guess... Oh, it's the like a furnace, like to keep things
warm.
warm.
That's right. So someone has to stay here 24/7 during the winter months, and the fumes from that fireplace actually enters into the greenhouse behind it, creating warmth for their more citrus and tropical plants and fruits.
This is the women's bunk room.
And similar to the men's, they're also double bunked. They also have
But they were saying like the kids just sleep on the floor.
Yep, and flat mats. And if you are infirmed or sickly or elderly, there's actually less chores for you to do. So you just stay here, you keep weaving or sewing or mending.
I was surprisingly, these rooms were very cool. It was hot outside, but when you enter, it
all the brick layers.
was really cool.
Yeah.
Upper garden. So this is like
his more formal
pretty,
floral
garden
where if he had guests, they would probably stroll through here after supper. And supper is 3 p.m. And so they actually eat early, but that's probably because they didn't have electricity and it was so dark by the time it's 5 p.m. So you have to see your food, right?
Yes.
But they did say that meal times take about 2 hours to go through.
So now we're back inside the welcome center, and
this is part of the restoration program. All the different managers or associations who were available and put themselves and their resources to helping ensure that Mount Vernon stayed restored and maintained and well kept.
This is just a collage of different years, different group shots by the Mount Vernon house. And this is Mount Vernon in, I don't know,
painted, in
a long time ago. I didn't see the year. It's probably written really small.
It is painted, and again, more pictures of those who were involved in its restoration. Lots of people, but mainly the first group of people were definitely the Daughters of the Revolution Association.
These are layers
of
from the house,
materials from the wall. So you have the wood, the wallpaper,
plaster,
and
then just some nice paintings of the rooms.
Yep. Over the years, different artists has their rendition.
We couldn't take footage, but then you'll see some photographs of how the rooms look like.
So again, just their
restoration.
How they made sure that the windows were kept the same. So again, over time and humidity and wear and tear of the weather, a house would go into shambles.
This is the first room we entered.
So this was the receiving formal parlor, and having paint that vivid was actually quite expensive. So just again, part of their claim to wealth. But George Washington himself didn't like to be too showy, so he actually didn't have a lot of things as opposed to the more wealthier patrons of society way back in his time. More rooms with lots of their large paintings here, and a lot of them are from artists of the days, depicting how Mount Vernon looked, and look how grand and majestic it was with its columns from the water view. And a number of their paintings, of course, were also about their family life. Here's George Washington, Martha, and their granddaughters sitting in their parlor.
That's a nice view.
And this is Virginia in the 1830s. Again, how the landscape looked during that time, when things were not as developed as, of course, today's time. Just to see the natural surroundings, the water, the Potomac River from their viewpoint. And it's quite a beautiful view when you are walking through their house, that you see a huge expanse of water just in your backyard.
This is cool.
This is a lithograph of a battle plan. And we can see the Americans versus the British, and how the Americans planned to surround the British during that battle.
And then just more maps.
This is with a different cartography, I suppose, with the different breakdown of land versus section acres of property.
Yeah, these were the maps back then, right?
Yeah.
How it would look.
So how they were able to survey and assess the land. It's pretty cool. And then of course create the print.
Here's George Washington in his uniform.
So of course they have a number of portraits painted by the artists popular then. This is their home wear for evening wear, again made of just breathable cotton. But ruffles were a nice, trendy, fashionable thing, so that had that.
These are the grandkids?
Yep, portraits of their 4 grandchildren, or really Martha's. And this was, again, them in their fine wear. That's the pictures of Martha's 2 children when they were young.
And that's them when they're older. Well, Martha and George. Here is, what kind of piano is this?
Harpsichord. This is a harpsichord. So it's a lot smaller than a piano. So a lot of families who like instruments would have one, and they would have other people play it.
This is cool. So through the generations, generation 1, this is George Washington's brother.
Yep, who owned the house before him, Lawrence Washington. And then when he passed away from tuberculosis, he bequeathed the house over to George Washington.
This is generation 2?
Yep.
So they're kids, or Martha's kids.
Yes.
And then generation 3
Which
are
their
the
grandchildren.
grandkids.
And again, you know,
And they're old now.
in terms of a family line, because George Washington didn't have any biological children of his own, he didn't really pass on his name beyond that. And again, the inheriting of the Mount Vernon went to, I think, a cousin after.
Here's a family tree of who the grandkids married.
Yep. So over the years, it tried to follow them still.
Here is Mount Vernon 10,000 years ago with information about the area back then. And then 1674, Mount Vernon. And then down here it says all the people that owned the property, starting with his great-grandfather all the way to George Washington.
So here we see becoming Mount Vernon, meaning the handing over of the estate from one son to another. Initially, the eldest brother, Lawrence Washington, was the one who received the plantation from their father, but upon his death, he bequeathed it to George Washington.
And here's the gift shop.
So they have a very huge collection of souvenirs and other knickknacks, shirts. They also have a lot of prints of Mount Vernon, as well as, of course, portraits of George Washington himself. In terms of their other collections in there, they also had a jewelry store too, about how jewelry looked like from that time period, as what Martha Washington had worn then.
And here are more shirts and just knickknacks that have Washington and Mount Vernon logos on them.
Yep, and there's actually 2 large gift stores, and there's also this area where they have Christmas knickknacks and ornaments available. They actually had the kinds of nutcrackers I collect, the Mueller kinds, and one was like a little pilgrim, so he was cute, but I did not purchase them. And they also have a lot of other ornaments here that has the collection of...
These are cool spoons. And they're engraved and some painted.
And they
very
have...
detailed.
Yep, different designs. Some of them are enameled like that and colorful.
A big bust of George Washington.
Just outside the restaurant, the takeout restaurant. And this was the other gift store I have. It's a bit more formal. It has some jewelry and some housewares that are a bit more on the pricier end of things.
Plates.
They also had like a whiskey area, and they also had like nuts and teas and coffees, but mainly teas because that was what they had drunk before. And they also have an apiary, so they had a beehive honey collection that they actually had bottled up and jarred, and that's a cool picture of the monetary use then.
And if you zoom in on that little information plaque, you can see how much these
values are.
Yeah, each value of
paper money, I guess. Although I don't know how they deal with change.
But it said like shillings in there and cents, and I don't know. And so here is a portrait of George Washington, a nice painting.
In his army general wear.
And then just lunchtime in the food court.
So there was something that was easy enough for takeout and eat simply for what the kids can choose for lunch. They had other more formal restaurants, but we didn't go there.